Right, can I welcome you all to the last of the current season of talks by the Walkley Historians. In case you don't know me, my name is Hugh, and I'm going to talk to you, as you can see, about crime and punishment, particularly in Walkley. It's not going to be a great in-depth academic study. I will show you the cover of an enormous thesis about the police, but I'm only going to probably say about 10 words about it, even though I might find it quite interesting. So, starting with a well-known picture I'm sure some of you will have seen and will recognise where it is. Behind all that ivy there is what most recently was flats. I don't know if it still is flats. Before that it was a dentist, and before that it was Walkley Police Station. And you can see on the left-hand side, just peeking through there, the old St Bartholomew's Church. And then you've got all these fascinating characters in front of it. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about the police to start with. Then I'm going to talk about the ne'er-do-wells and perpetrators and people who got up to mischief and into trouble for a bit. And then, depending on the time, because I'm not sure how long it'll take, I will come back to talk about the police and also, particularly the fantastic records there are in the archives, which I've been having a quick look at. Now, first of all, I am going to challenge you. I am going to assume that you are applying to become detectives in the Sheffield Police Force. And I'm going to ask you to follow in the footsteps and to honour this guy who, although he became the chief detective in Sheffield, started his police career in Walkley and lived in Walkley Road. And as you can see, he was particularly known for his fantastic memory over many years. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions about the picture that came before. How many people were in the picture? Just as an estimate, I'm going to ask maybe 3 people to have a guess how many people there were.
100.
50, 100? 80. Right. And I'll show you the other 2 questions. How many are in uniform and how many women? Any thoughts? How many were not in uniform? No, 1. And I think the last question is easy because there weren't any women. Although, now I don't know the date of that photograph. I'm guessing it might be between 1900 and the First World War. So that isn't actually very long before the first women became police officers in Sheffield, because that was all because of the First World War. At the beginning of the First World War, there were what was called the women's patrols, and they patrolled the busy streets of the city at night looking for young people who were vulnerable or up to mischief. And then, because that was so successful, they appointed the first woman police officer. And in 1919, after the war, when the police paraded and were inspected, there was 1 woman police officer in Sheffield. I just mentioned about the women's patrols. I read one report where it said that during a particular period, I'm not sure how long, they had dealt with 200 boys. So, anyway, right. So how many people are there? Let's right. 64 uniformed officers, 3 men in civilian clothes. I'll show you the picture again in a moment. Now, so the 3 men in civilian clothes are on the right-hand side. Now, the people who are the men where I can't see moustaches, they might be such fair moustaches, they have them anyway. I'm not sure they would want to stand out. One thing I just noticed, just looking at it at this scale, is I hadn't noticed the 3 sergeants in the middle, in the back there. I assume those are sergeants with the stripes. Right, and here's a more recent picture of the police station. I'm not sure exactly which year it opened. It was agreed that it was going to be built in 1870, and it was mentioned, the first mention in the newspaper was in 1873 or something like that. This is the mention of the thesis I was talking about. And I only put that there because I wanted to put this on. I was trying to get some idea of how, in my mind, to organise all these things about crimes and misdemeanours and breaking of regulations. And here is just one researcher's idea of 4 roles of the police force. So we've got first patrollers, keeping local order and crime prevention, which is really what the earliest police in Sheffield were about. I'm sure there were constables before 1818 when the improvement commissioners were created, and they could have their own police force and raise money for it. And they, first of all, just employed the watchman, and they only patrolled at night, so they were to protect property, which is not surprising since the people who were hiring them and paying them were generally the middle class who had the property that was at risk. State function, I don't think I'm going to be saying anything about Walkley police policing riots or political agitation, well, not much anyway. But of course in Sheffield, when in the 1870s, it wasn't that long before that there had been the Chartists. There had been, in 1832, there was a riot to do with the demands for political reform in which 5 people were shot dead by soldiers. The reason why it's not talked about like Peterloo, which is quite a similar thing, is that the people responsible, the magistrate who ordered it wasn't from Sheffield, and the soldiers weren't from Sheffield, and the first magistrate from Sheffield who got there stopped them firing. Anyway, that's before really the period that I'm mainly talking about. Thief takers, obviously, they're watching for people entering premises or the signs that premises have been entered and trying to arrest the malefactors. And regulation. So if the watch was about protecting property, then there's a whole new range of powers and interests that gradually came to the police and other civil authorities, regulating things, as it says here, like street vendors, pubs, cabs, etc., and also things to do with health. If there was infectious disease, like there often was in the 19th century, the police would be looking out for infected people who were out and about where they shouldn't be and things like that, and prosecuting them. I'm also going to just say a couple of things about the newspapers. Because most of the stories that I found came from the newspapers, I have to bear in mind the biases, the natural biases there are in newspapers, which is just summarised very quickly here. So they tend to look for things that they can fit into a category, and they treat those things the same, each of the categories. And obviously they want things that are newsworthy, and they're probably the same things that are newsworthy now. Things to do with gender, particularly women in situations which was thought not to be respectable. So respectable women in situations in court, being arrested, committing crime, would be very newsworthy. Ethnicity here in the 19th century, we're really talking about, in the newspapers, the Irish immigrants into Sheffield, which the newspapers would make a point of always identifying them if they were Irish, and also the particular areas in Sheffield where they came from, and class, where people have, according to the newspapers, pretensions above their station or of falling from a higher point to a lower point in the class structure. Right, so I'm now going to go on to talk about some things that went on in Walkley, and I'm going to start with this quote. There is heavy irony in this quote. I do actually quote this sometimes because this is the beginning of an article about someone that I talked about in a previous talk who liked to be known as the Baron. The report goes on to talk about the embarrassment not only of the people who are immediately affected by that confidence trickster, but also in general the people in Walkley who didn't usually have to put up with such things. And I put it here because I found, going through the newspapers, and what I did was I went through the whole of one particular year looking for mentions of Walkley in the reports of the magistrates' courts, and that was 1902. And I chose that year because I knew that there were also prison records for that year, and also because it was just after a census year. So I thought there was sources that I could use to look at some of those people. And then, as a comparison, I've started, but I haven't really got as far with 1872. I've only looked at 3 months of that year. So I'm now going to just show you the 1872 things I've found. And to be honest, Walkley is ridiculously law-abiding, judging by the magistrates' courts. I can put all of the cases on 2 slides from those 3 months in 1872, the ones that mention Walkley, and some of them are to do with the victims of crime who were in or came from Walkley, and then some of them are perpetrators. So this is the first one, just showing you some of the offences. You can see there are, in 4 cases, there are people from Walkley who are accused and 2 victims. I'm going to come back briefly to the stealing broken glass in a minute. And yes, 3 more, yes. Yes, I wish I could tell you more about that. I'm still getting to grips with that case. It's yes, they failed to get the marriage annulled, so she remained married. Anyway, but the others were sent to prison. How many is that? That's 1, 2, 3. So 10 cases. I can tell you that in the same period, there were 10 cases that mentioned Cambridge Street. That's just one street. And just to compare with city centre streets. And the magistrate made a particular point of saying how ridiculous it was that respectable people could not walk down Cambridge Street without being molested or robbed or attacked. Right, so the stealing broken glass. Now, they're not from Walkley, but they somehow came to Walkley, or for some reason came to Walkley, and they were trying to steal a basket of glass from, well, it says the Howard Inn here. I think of it as the Howard Hotel that used to stand at the top of Howard Hill. What were they going to do with it? It's just broken glass. Well, 2 things. Just what were they going to get for it? Why was the landlord keeping it? And why did they get such severe punishment just for stealing that? Well, it was partly because they had previous convictions. I haven't been really able to identify them in the census before or after, but I'm going to keep trying. Now, one reason why I put that up here, because it gives me a chance to talk about the training ship. This is a picture of the training ship. Now, in 1866, this ship, which was moored in the Humber, was acquired as, basically it's a floating industrial school where boys who get into trouble can be sent to learn about being sailors, really, and the sea. And various local authorities, and eventually Sheffield, bought into this, and they would pay the people who ran the ship so that these boys could be part of that school. One reason I'm interested in is because I have a suspicion that this is why this solves a problem about this person. This is in Walkley Cemetery, and I puzzled for this for a long time about this Ernest Reynolds lost at sea, age 17. And then eventually I discovered he was actually an able seaman on a cargo ship that was carrying coal from a port in Australia north to, and I can't remember exactly where, somewhere like Singapore. And it left port on a fine day in calm weather and was never seen again. But I kept asking myself, how does someone from Sheffield or Walkley become a sailor if doesn't appear to be any other sailors or experience of the sea in their family? And I also discovered that his father had been prosecuted for embezzlement, and also that his parents had split up. So I'm guessing that this guy, Ernest Reynolds, may, like George Dyson, have ended up in the training ship. But I don't know, that's just a guess. Right, now I'm now going to talk about a particular family that rather fascinates me, and I'm sorry that Joanne, who has been involved in the project, isn't here, because this is essentially her family, and she gave me some of the photos, and it's all connected with this place, where I spend rather a lot of time. Right, so we've actually got 3 properties here as one block. We've got the cafe, and then 2 houses, one of which used to be a butcher's, the one with the surviving shop front. They were all built at the same time by the same family, and they were butchers and cowkeepers. And I should say that behind, eventually, not to start off with, there was a cow shed, and eventually also a slaughterhouse, because it's mentioned in sales details later. Right, don't worry if you can't see this, because I'm going to blow up little bits of this. This is actually a family tree. The bits in red show people who, for various reasons, ended up in court, either for things that they'd done or because they were the victims of crime, or for breaking of regulations, just thinking about those different roles of the police. So I'm going to look first at this person, James Lemons. Now, although he's called James, in the records, for some reason, he's called John, but I'm pretty sure this is the same person. Now, these are fantastic Wakefield prison records. Pretty good handwriting compared to some. So he is a disorderly apprentice, and simply for absenting himself from his master, he has been sentenced to 1 month hard labour. One of the things in the thesis that I mentioned that is said is that there were these sort of unwritten laws that people tended to apply, and one of those was that the masters of apprentices were entitled, if necessary, to use violence to control their apprentices, in other words, beating them. It also says the same rule tended to apply at this period to families and to husbands, heads of families. So, I'm going to move on to Brother William, victim of assault. In fact, victim of 2 assaults. This is the first one in 1858, when I think he was about 19. The family had not yet moved to Walkley. They were in Broad Lane. A neighbour called on William Lemons and noticed that there was a window open in the house. And he looked through, and William Lemons was the other side, and he asked him why the window was open, and William said he didn't know. And then at that moment, someone came up behind him and hit him on the head with an iron bar, and then hit him again. There were reports which suggested that they did not expect William to live, but it appears that he did, as I'll show you in a moment. The perpetrator of that was sentenced to 15 years penal servitude. And I think it was just 1858, so it's just too late, I think, for him to be transported. It's after the end of the main period of transportation. But I'll tell you about the second occasion when he was assaulted, because he was actually assaulted in 1874, so sometime later. But that was by his son. And his son was prosecuted and bound over for assaulting him. It's clear from the newspapers that there's a lot going on which wasn't said, and it wasn't clear whether William started it or not. Just in connection with William again, his granddaughter in 1904 was falsely accused of theft, but was compensated for false imprisonment by the shopkeeper. It's just this family just goes on, getting into court. Right, now this is Francis Lemons. As far as I'm concerned, this is the main guy, the most interesting guy, because I'm quite interested in cowkeepers and butchers and the relationship between those 2 roles. And also we have these fantastic pictures that Joanne gave me. So this is Francis Lemons. It actually says, although you can't read it, on this resolution, Walkley, Francis Lemons Walkley, I think it might say South Road on there. And then here he is doing what he really loved best, which is showing off his animals at shows. I'm guessing that the guy in the hat and the coat is probably one of the judges, but he also turns out to be a fairly irascible character. So this is an event that happened. I'll tell you the date in a moment. There was this other cowkeeper called John Johnson. Now, he actually farmed some of the land was round Walkley Hall. And both he and Francis Lemons loved showing off their animals. But John Johnson always seemed to come out above Francis Lemons. And Francis Lemons didn't like that at all. And it annoyed him. And this tended to come out, particularly when he'd drunk a little bit. Yes. So they met up at some point, probably by chance or maybe after the market, in a place called the Alexandra Hotel. I'm not sure where in town that was. And as it says in the newspaper report, a discussion took place. And this is part of the discussion. So after a certain amount of this sort of banter, Johnson left and got on the tram. When he got to the next stop, Lemons got on the tram, and so they were on the same tram all the way to Walkley. Now, Francis Lemons would normally have got off at the stop near Gertie's, but he didn't. He stayed on the tram, and they both got off at the terminus at the end of South Road. And at some point, after Johnson started walking towards Walkley Hall, something happened. Now, depends who you believe what exactly happened. But according to Johnson, Lemons, this is what he said, "I'll strangle thee," and grabbed him and pulled him into an entry, and there was basically a fight. And Johnson had an injured leg, injured fingers, because he said that Francis Lemons had bitten his fingers. And I think he had a head injury as well. And so Johnson sued for damages in the court, sued for £25, 12 and 6, which is quite a lot of money, but had got 50 shillings. Now, just going back to for a moment, you can see just peeking over the top of the little cart there is the top of a milk churn. So presumably he's going and selling milk. And particularly at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, people who were selling milk, they were subject to quite stringent regulations to do with how much milk solids there was in the milk. Now, I don't know enough about it, but it just seems to me very unfair what was said, because the regulations said that if the required level of milk solids wasn't in the milk, then it was assumed that they had added water. So I think Francis Lemons was prosecuted twice in the same year for adding water to his milk, and he clearly didn't like it very much. And I found lots of other cowkeepers suffering the same thing, because they would say that it depends on the state of the grass, really, how good the milk is. So here we are, July 1906, his lawyer said that the reason why the solids was not to scratch is because of the huge amount of milk that the cow was giving. And he was actually given the benefit of the doubt and only required to pay the costs. But when he came up in December, £2 is quite a heavy fine for this. Right, we're now going to move on to his daughter, who is Alice. According to what Francis Lemons said in court when Alice came up before the magistrates, she had left home 2 years before, and he hadn't seen her for a year. He hadn't known where she was. Right, so this is the Wakefield prison records. And she was prosecuted for stealing clothing and obtaining board and lodging by false pretences. She had this story that she was on her way to the asylum to take up a job as a nurse, but she hadn't quite got there, and could she possibly have a room for the night? And she did this twice, and both times she either took things from the house or simply went away without paying any money for the board and lodging, even though she said to start off with she had money. Yes, the first time she stole a gold brooch and sixpence. The second time a skirt, blouse and boots. And when she was arrested, she was wearing the blouse and the skirt. And then food and lodging. She said, on that occasion, she said she was an orphan, but she had 10 shillings a week for life. She stayed 2 weeks and then left without paying. She was committed to go to the sessions. It was considered serious enough for that, and she was sent to prison for 5 months. Right, continuing with the Lemons family, on and on and on. Right, now this is Francis Jr., the son of Francis the Butcher. In 1888 he went into a pub, which I think, yes, the Travellers' Rest on Lancet Road. He asked for some beer. The barman was reading a newspaper and didn't notice to start off with, and out of irritation Francis Lemons picked up a pitcher and hit him with it, hit him over the head with it, causing a cut and an eye injury. And he was, as it says here, he was sent to prison for 1 month with hard labour. I'm really sorry that Joanne isn't here. I'm sure she'd love it. Right, now this one, I'm not sure that she agrees that this is the right person. Frank Lemons, 1913, prosecuted for maintenance of an illegitimate child. Now, I haven't found anything else about this. Tried to look for a baptism or a birth, but it's very difficult to work out which child it might be. And it says, as you can see, it says he was due to pay 42 and 6 or spend 17 days in prison. Now, I don't know which one he chose, although I think this is actually from Wakefield, so he probably served the 17 days. Right, that is actually the last of the Lemons family, until I find more. Right, I'm just going to talk about one or two other people. I don't know if people recognise this house. Corner of Burgoyne Road and Walkley Street. Now this used to be a pub, as it says, the Municipal Inn. I'm sure it was called the Municipal because just over the road there was the Freehold Land Society. In fact, there were 2 Freehold Land Societies which were called the First and Second Municipal Land Society. So they include Hadfield Street, Cromwell Street, Duncombe Street, Fulton Road and Matlock Road, and had a boundary, I think, on Heavygate Road. One of the landlords of this pub was called Mordecai Tim, which is, I think, is a great name. And at a certain point, a certain Alfred Smith, engraver, was courting one of Mordecai Tim's daughters. But for some reason, there was a falling out, and Alfred Smith was shown the door. And out of pique, he came back late at night and he made his way into the garden and he tore up about 50 plants. He broke into the greenhouse and willfully destroyed about 600 plants in the greenhouse. Total damage being as much as £15. And he was sued in court, but he claimed that there was some of his property in the house which they had prevented him from retrieving, and that was why he was so angry and why he acted. The sister of the prisoner appeared and said he had been courting the prosecutor's daughter. The judge said, but people don't do things like that when they court the daughter. The sister, who evidently had no love for either the prosecutor or his family, said prisoner was to have been married at Easter, and then they were supposed to be married at Whitsun, but it kept being put off. She added, he was a good lad before he knew that thing there. They had ruined him. The daughter of the prosecutor, so this is the daughter of Mordecai Tim, who was engaged to the prisoner, admitted that there was some furniture that belonged to the prisoner. And then the parties talked to each other and agreed about the furniture, and the stipendiary, that's the judge, ordered the prisoner to pay the amount of the damage or go to jail for 14 days. That's what it says in the Daily Telegraph. In the Independent, it adds that he said, I will take the 14 days. He refused to pay the money. Alfred Smith later married someone else and lived, as far as I can tell, a respectable life, and his family are buried in the cemetery. Mordecai Tim is also buried in the cemetery. There's quite a long way between them, which is probably just as well. Yes, I think that's just part of that. Right, I'm not going to say too much more about the Baron because I did give a whole talk about it a few years ago. I'll just remind people who may not know anything about him. In 1883, I think it was, a German emigre came to Sheffield and particularly seemed to hang around Walkley. He was known for being willing and able to talk and argue on any subject. He was also known to be apparently generous with his money in buying alcohol for other people in pubs. But he also particularly liked talking about his misfortunes, how he was the heir to considerable property and money, but he couldn't get hold of it because of various conditions of the will of his uncle and aunt. He also claimed that he was related to the Waldeck family, which is an aristocratic German family, and one of the Waldecks had married Prince Leopold, the youngest son of Queen Victoria, and that, I think they were the Duke and Duchess of Albany, and he pretended to write letters to the Duchess of Albany and got other people, because he said his handwriting was not very good, to address them, but none of those letters were actually sent. And all the time he was doing this, he was looking for people who he could get lots of money from, and with an accomplice he swindled someone in London for £600. He was eventually caught. Yes, he was caught in Sheffield and taken down, prosecuted at the Old Bailey, and he got 5 years in jail. The reason I put this picture up is because after he got out of jail, he committed a similar offence, and on that occasion he was said to have enjoyed riffling a big bunch of banknotes to show off his cash. But it turned out that what he'd actually got were these things, which are advertisements for a particular kind of whiskey. And he had cut them out of the newspapers and made a big bundle of them. And the reason why that's relevant to what he did in Walkley is because there were occasions in Walkley where he showed large amounts of money, but it wasn't discovered at that point that he was probably doing the same thing. People who came to the talk I gave before might remember that at the end I rewarded everybody for coming by giving them a £5 note, which was basically one of these. So I won't say any more about the Baron. Right, I'm just going to come back to the officers of the police. This is just a summary of how many police officers there were in Sheffield altogether, 531. Something which I don't know, because I've only just found this thing from 1907. It says that these people were appointed at private cost. I don't know what that's about, but I'd like to know. So we saw 64 uniformed officers in whatever year it was that early photograph was from. So that, I don't know, that's an appreciable number. I think Walkley was an important division. I'm not sure how many divisions there were in 1907. So I was going to talk about police officers and what records there are. Now I have a problem, or I found a problem when I was looking at what are some really beautiful records, is that they don't tend to say which division these police officers belong to. So I have to find other ways of connecting individual officers to Walkley. Now one way is simply to look for incidents in the newspapers where it says that the Walkley constable arrested such and such a person. But I found a really good way of getting the names of Walkley police officers are these. The Walkley police cricket team was very active at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. So I actually made a table of the names of the team. In this case, it seems that there's quite a few people who are not actual officers, because it says PC and sergeant in front of the officers, and then the gentlemen or the honourable members, I don't know who they are. I need to investigate those. But anyway, I had to have all these names, which meant I could go to name indexes in the archives and see if I could find any of these people. I really only started doing that. I'm going to show you two different classes of records, and the first one is the probationer's book. I looked at one volume of this and I was going through looking for the people who had Walkley addresses who are applying to be police officers, and I looked through 2 years of these applicants before I found one Walkley person who was accepted as an officer. I think there must have been 20 who were rejected, which quite surprised me. I get the impression that about half the people in general who applied were accepted. So in this one, which I'm going to show you just a detail of it, this is the first person I found from Walkley who was accepted as a police officer. And he had the advantage, which I'll show you on the next slide, of a family connection with the police force. This is the information you have. You've got age, height, address, trade. It will tell you he was single, but it will tell you if he had any children, if he was married. Now he actually had served in the armed forces, so it tells you there the details. They obviously asked him if they were well acquainted with the borough, and he was. Has he any friends or relatives in the force? Yes, he has a brother, PC 41 Swallow. So this is probably one good reason why they looked favourably upon him. And is he a member of a sick club? Police were very mindful of the money they might have to pay out if officers were sick or injured. So they wanted to know how much of any sickness or injury would be covered by a sick club, in other words, insurance. And he was accepted. Fantastic. And this also tells you the date when he actually joined. And here he is. 2 pictures of Charles Swallow. I don't think I've noted on a slide, but he was given leave to rejoin the army to go to South Africa, and he served in South Africa in the Boer War, and then returned to the Walkley Police. Now he did actually play cricket, although he wasn't on that particular scorecard that I showed you. Now the other class of records in the archives are conduct and commendation books, where there's a double page, not necessarily for one officer. If one officer then left the force, then they would put somebody else on the same page. But some officers have a whole of two pages of this big volume, all about the good things they did and also the bad things they did. Because on one side you have rewards, and on the other, which most often has more things on it, you have discipline. So this is the only thing down reward for Constable Swallow, for stopping a runaway horse in Spittal Hill. I don't know what he's doing in Spittal Hill. Now I haven't put all the discipline ones in because there were just too many. So the sort of thing, being absent from his residence while on the sick list. So he's supposed to be at home, fined £1 shilling, selling lottery tickets when he shouldn't be, and yes, any police officer who was given a gratuity by a member of the public or a firm or so on had to declare it, and in this case he hadn't, and this was being discovered, and so he was being disciplined for it. Right. Just thinking of regulation, and there's some places in the thesis I read where it talks about police being domestic missionaries, because they have, to a certain extent, a role in going in and settling disputes, for instance, settling domestic disputes. Also, for counteracting immorality. We heard about the officers who knew about the loose women, and those words are actually used about the people in Orchard Road. So there's a certain duty to counteract immorality and to protect the weak and the vulnerable from such people. So I'm going to just look at one more. Nathaniel Swift, who was the person applying for the licence. This is his grave in Walkley Cemetery. I'm just going to go past that. So one thing I haven't done, which I meant to do, because I talked about 1872, and so I've got all of the Walkley mentions from 1902, which is a lot more. I haven't had time really to process them. So I am going to choose 3 at random and see what I come up with. Shoplifting in Sheffield. Mary Esther Martin, or Siddle, a married woman living at 18 Creswick Street, was charged with stealing a shawl from the shop of John Walsh, Draper, High Street. Walsh's. She was in the shop, seen by a shop walker to take the shawl and place it under her skirts, and was walking off with it when she was stopped and given into the custody of Detective Sergeant White. She pleaded with the judge to give her one more chance, but he said that she had gone too far for him to deal with her. She was committed for trial at the sessions, and I do know what happened to her, because there are prison records for her, and if I can read it, 2 months hard labour she got. Two more. Another one. Regulating society also involved watching out for people who were betting. Now there's quite a few references to people who were bookmakers taking bets in the street and giving out betting tickets. There's one occasion, I haven't actually got the actual text with me, where 2 police officers hid behind the wall of the vicarage, looking down onto Walkley Lane, and observed a man who was there for some time, and people kept coming up to him and giving him money and taking little bits of paper. And the bookmaker was prosecuted and fined for that. But that happens again and again. And in this particular one, right, let me find the relevant details. 3 summonses in each case. Walter Hoffman of Limbrick Road, James Porter of Bowness Road was summoned for frequenting Holm Lane and Walkley Lane for the purpose of betting. And the rule they were breaking was, no person shall frequent and use any street or public place on behalf either of himself or of any other person for the purpose of bookmaking or betting or wagering or agreeing to bet or wager with any person or paying or receiving or settling bets. Now there was actually quite a lot of opposition for this, because this was something that quite a lot of people felt should not be regulated so strictly by the courts and by the law. And these prosecutions were being challenged because it was felt by some people that it wasn't being prosecuted under the right law. And so they actually adjourned them all, I think, but eventually did prosecute them and convict them. Right, another case of regulation, exposure with infectious diseases. Charles Thicket, aged 17 years, was charged with willfully exposing himself in Addis Street while suffering from diphtheria on July the 8th, this is 1902. Inspector Green, who I believe it came from Walkley Police Station, investigated the case and visited the house again on July the 8th, and the boy had gone out to a neighbour's house, and the magistrate imposed a fine of £1, including costs. And there was another case where the magistrate was very strict and annoyed about a woman who had found that a man in her boarding house was suffering from smallpox, and she had put him in a cab and taken him to the workhouse. And the workhouse had not been able to take him, and so she had then put him in the cab and brought him home again. And both the woman was prosecuted, the cabman was prosecuted because he did not immediately disinfect his cab. I think I've actually just about come to the end. Thank you for listening.